So in this video, we're going to be looking at proving that triangles are congruent. So the directions, we're going to use the information in the figure to prove that triangle ACD is congruent to triangle CAB. So remember, to prove that these triangles are congruent, so when we're seeing it from all of these congruent figures, is that the corresponding sides need to be congruent and the corresponding angles need to be congruent. So we need to show that all three sides are congruent to another three, and all three angles are congruent to another three angles. So first I'm going to fill out this given information, and we need to pull that information from this figure. So I'm going to start with the sides I know that are congruent. I see that AD is congruent to BC. And that's because they both have that one tick mark. I'm going to go ahead and just write that down here as well. I see that AB is also congruent to DC. And that's because they both have the two tick marks, marking that they're congruent. And then I see I have some arc marks here. So I see that angle DAC is congruent to angle BCA. That's because they both have the one arc mark. And then I also see that angle BAC is congruent to angle DCA. And that's because they both have those two tick marks. And so all of that is my given. So I'm given a lot of information here. I already have two pairs of congruent sides, and I have two pairs of congruent angles. Now I just need to show that that third side is congruent and that third angle. Well, I see that this third side is actually a shared side. It's AC for both of them. And whenever we have the same thing, by the reflexive property, I can automatically say, well, that means that AC is congruent to AC. The same side is going to be congruent to itself. And remember, that's our reflexive property. So I have three congruent sides. I can mark that in here. Now I need to somehow say that angle D is congruent to angle B. Well, I can actually say that right off the bat from a theorem that we just learned. From our previous video, we learned that if two angles are congruent to two angles of another triangle, then the third angles are also congruent. So remember, that was our third angles theorem. And so I already have that all three sides are congruent, all three angles are congruent, so I can therefore say that triangle ACD is congruent to triangle CAB. And the reasoning for that is that all corresponding parts are congruent. Okay, let's look at another one. So here we're going to be using this diagram here. First, it's asking me to find the measure of angle HGI. So I want to know what that angle is. Well, first I know that angle K is congruent to angle H because I have those arc marks. So I know that this is 87. So I really want to show that there's another pair of angles that are congruent to each other, so I can use my third angles theorem. Well, looking at this figure, I see that I have a pair of vertical angles right here. And what we learned about vertical angles in some of our previous units is that they're congruent to each other. So I know that these two angles are congruent. So now I have two pairs of congruent angles. And what we know from the third angles theorem, so I'm going to say by third angles theorem, angle HGI is congruent to angle KJI. Well, angle KJI is 65 degrees, so that means that the measure of angle HGI is equal to 65 degrees. Now, what additional information is needed to conclude that GHI, or triangle GHI, is congruent to triangle JKI? Well, I already have three angles that are all congruent, so all my corresponding angles are congruent. So that just leaves showing that my corresponding sides are also congruent. I see immediately that I am given that HI is congruent to IK because of these tick marks. But I don't know anything about the other two sides. So what we would say here is we need to know that HG is, or GH is congruent to JK. And that GI is congruent to JI.